Welcome everybody to today's session, Innovative Financing for Green Infrastructure, Waves and Water Funding. My name is Diana Salido, and I am the Director for the Leadership Development Program here at River Network. And this is the fourth webinar on a series that we've been hosting on water infrastructure. You can view the others on River Network's YouTube channel. And so through these webinars, this is the last in the series, and we've been examining how communities generate the money for water projects, both traditional pipes and treatment, and the topic of today's session, green infrastructure. Looking at how investment decisions are being made and how local organizations can play a role in securing the sort of infrastructure investments that communities need for both drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater. So welcome. If this is the first session you've attended, glad to have you here. So today, just if you're new to River Network, just really briefly, we're a national organization that connects water-focused nonprofits, agencies, businesses, and communities for greater local impact and healthier rivers across the country. And you can see there part of our vision, which includes a future of clean and ample water for people and nature, and local caretakers that are well-equipped, effective, and courageous champions for our rivers. So welcome to you all, local caretakers. Glad to have you here. Today's webinar is sponsored with support from the C.S. Mott Foundation and the Urban Waters Learning Network. And if you're new to the Learning Network, we are a national network of nearly 150 organizations. The network is coordinated through a partnership between us at River Network and our partners at Groundwork USA. And it's a peer-to-peer network of both people and organizations that are working to restore and revitalize urban waterways and the communities that surround them. So members of the Learning Network are working extensively to address stormwater issues in their communities, including everything from installing green infrastructure projects, advocating for more funding and more stringent GI requirements, and developing community leadership to make sure that investments in green infrastructure are equitable and provide multiple benefits to community members, including jobs. So you can learn more if you're doing work in green infrastructure, and that's why you joined today, but are not familiar with the Learning Network. Take a look at that URL at the bottom, and you'll see a lot of examples of the work of members of the network through our resource library there. And before moving ahead, I do want to say that this webinar series on water infrastructure investments builds off a recently released drinking water guide that my colleague Catherine Baer led the charge of. And in this guide, which you can download in our website, it explores multiple aspects of the economics and funding of drinking water infrastructure, including designing and setting water rates, measuring affordability, and addressing issues of water shutoffs and other issues related to equity on the affordability front. So even if your work doesn't currently focus on drinking water in your community, and you're mostly focusing on the stormwater aspects of that, we do encourage you to take a look at the guide and consider the connections between today's topic of stormwater management and green infrastructure and drinking water. So with that, I want to turn to today's topic, innovative financing for green infrastructure. As we have moved past the early phase for green infrastructure, many of our communities, and I anticipate that many of yours are part of this, we're focusing attention on really scaling up the use of green infrastructure, both to address stormwater and to enjoy the many other benefits that GI provides. And so we come to this question of funding. So in today's session, we have two excellent presenters that are going to explore how green infrastructure projects are being financed across the country using both traditional financing sources, stormwater utilities, and some innovative financing models. We're going to look at Atlanta's use of environmental impact municipal bonds, which is a very exciting new development in the area of financing. So I want to go ahead and introduce our two speakers, and there's a tag team. We'll start off with Stacey Isaac Berahzer, who is the founder of IB Environmental. Stacey has over 16 years of experience in the environmental field, previously served as Senior Project Director with the Environmental Finance Center here in North Carolina at the University University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Her main areas of expertise are pricing and affordability of water services, as well as stormwater and watershed management. She's got an undergraduate degree from North Carolina Central University and Masters of Public Administration from Chapel Hill. Stacey works mainly out of Georgia, where she's very involved in leadership in the environmental community, including with the Institute for Georgia Environmental Leadership, and is teaching at the Georgia Association of Water Professionals Leadership Academy. So you've probably seen Stacey's name around. She's been around for many, many years and is definitely one of the leaders in this field of pricing and financing for water services. So glad to have Stacey here, and she's going to be joined by Amanda Hallauer, who has been with the City of Atlanta Department of Watershed Management for about 2 years in the Environmental Planning Division, where she's responsible for advancing plans, policies, and projects dealing with green infrastructure, and has managed efforts to acquire floodplain property under FEMA's hazard mitigation program, and most relevant to today's session, coordinated the use of environmental impact bond financing to implement restoration and resilience projects in Atlanta's West Side. Prior to that, she had 14 years of experience working with D.R. Horn Company out of D.C., a planning firm that supports the Conservation Fund. Amanda has a master's in environmental management from Duke University and was a Doris Duke Conservation Fellow there, and has done undergraduate work at Tulane University. So super excited to have these two experts join us. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Stacey, who's going to go ahead and get us started with the presentation. Stacey, I think it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Deanna. And thanks to the River Network for hosting this webinar series. Hopefully everything's working smoothly here, but thank you all of you for joining us here today as well. A good turnout. And all right, so I'm gonna assume that everyone is seeing my screen, and I'll move ahead. So we're talking about innovative financing for green infrastructure today. Just a little bit about what IB Environmental does. We do a little bit of Caribbean environmental management work. That happens to be where I'm from. Stormwater and watershed management, like we're talking about today, and how you fund projects. So this area that we call funding sources. And then water affordability and equity has been a big part of this 4-part webinar series. And so the first couple webinars in the series, we really focused on those areas. Probably more in terms of drinking water, I guess. All right, today what we're going to focus on is this idea that I like to refer to as the evolution from managing and funding point sources of pollution in water towards managing and funding non-point sources of water pollution in the US. Then we'll talk a little bit about adapting some of the more traditional methods of water finance to better suit green infrastructure projects. Stormwater utilities, I think, deserve their own unique special bullet. So we'll talk about them as well. And then we'll look at some of the newer, more innovative financing sources that have been emerging. I use this term crosswalking. When I say that, I'm referring to getting two different groups onto the same page. So in this webinar series, sort of an underlying theme has been me trying to play the role of connector, if you will, where there's sort of one group, the sort of more grassroots water organizations, and then the other group would probably be the water utility staff, and trying to get these two groups to talk the same language, be on the same page, and sort of recognize common areas of interest. The word connector, I guess, comes from this book called The Tipping Point, How Little Things Can Make a Big Difference by Malcolm Gladwell that he published in 2000. And it refers to connectors as people in the community who are in the habit of making introductions, right? So we talk about using the same terms, for instance, between these two different groups, and kind of making sure that we're not focusing on differences, but finding areas of commonality. So, all right. So in terms of the evolution, you know, in the US, traditionally, or at first, we focused, for good reason, on managing point sources of water pollution. So that's the background, and that's kind of where most of the water quality management really started. And then we progressed to dealing with non-point sources of water pollution, such as detention ponds, etc., right? So even constructed wetlands. Then we started to move to more distributed green infrastructure projects. So although green infrastructure projects are kind of mushrooming across many states, the sort of single site, larger green project still seems to be more dominant among, say, stormwater utility managers, for instance. A wetland project, which is directly connected to a wastewater treatment plant, for instance, is still easier for folks in local government to digest, especially in terms of a repayment plan. So if they got a loan for a project like that, how they're going to repay it, right? So this session today is looking at how some states are approaching the more distributed types of green infrastructure, such as rain gardens and permeable pavement, cisterns, etc. We can probably try to put in time periods here if we like, but it's also important to realize that we're still working on the point source projects, right? There are still spills in that area, so we definitely need to keep managing point sources as well. So this is, maybe evolution isn't the best word, maybe it's more of a layering, but that's this framework at least helps me to kind of look at how water quality has been happening in the country. So that said, this picture here that you see is a cistern. It's a type of green infrastructure, but the plaque here says that it's from the 1890s. The cistern was used as a storage tank for the collection of rainwater in the days when cocoa and coffee prospered. And I took this picture on a beach in Trinidad. And so this is where the evolution concepts gets interesting, right? It's almost like what's old is new again. So cisterns have been used traditionally in some areas in the past, and so they're kind of making a comeback. Of course, not all cisterns look like old concrete vessels. So this is an example from the North Carolina Botanical Gardens in Chapel Hill, and it's more modern looking because it's newer. But if we use EPA's definition of green infrastructure, one of their definitions is that green infrastructure is an array of products, technologies, and practices that use or mimic natural systems or engineered systems that mimic natural processes to enhance overall environmental quality and provide utility services. I wanted to kind of make sure we're all talking about the same thing when we say green infrastructure. I've seen it defined more broadly as interconnected areas where wildlife can move about freely, and that's sort of a more general definition. So the distributed nature of green infrastructure best management practices, right? That's what GIBMPs stand for there. Because they are distributed across a jurisdiction, there are inherent challenges. Since the goal of a green infrastructure program is to treat stormwater as close to where the stormwater is generated as possible, so this is where the rain would fall or where the snow would melt, green infrastructure best management practices are by nature scattered across the jurisdiction, and that scattered nature makes installation of them as well as operating and maintaining them more difficult for local governments since the sites are spread all over. In many cases, local governments, cities, counties, etc., are installing green infrastructure on their own lands and buildings, their streets, their sidewalks, parks, and rooftops. But an effective green infrastructure program really includes many sites that are ideal for green infrastructure that are on private property, and that can be a challenge. So when you're talking with local government officials and you're trying to get them to encourage green infrastructure, just keep in mind and empathize with the fact that when you are talking about installing features on private property, it doesn't fit very well the traditional local government structure, and that keeps them up at night. How are they going to maintain these things, for instance? So I think the key here is getting private landowners to take actions that would benefit the public overall, right? And that's easier said than done. But we'll talk about stormwater utilities, for instance, later on, and we'll see there that offering credits and incentives within a stormwater utility, for instance, really helps to get at this private property issue. All right, so just like managing non-point sources or water quality in general has been evolving, I would say that stormwater finance or green infrastructure finance has been evolving too, right? At first, general revenue tax money was used to manage stormwater on public lands. Then we started to see a suite of regulations that encourage projects on private property. Eventually, we saw impact fees and offset fees in cases like the Jordan Lake in North Carolina, where the developers were asked to pay a fee to mitigate the harmful impacts that their projects would have on water quality. Then fourthly, we've been seeing the creation of independent stormwater utilities that are enterprise funds within local governments. So this is a nod back to maybe the webinar 1 in the series where we talked about local government finance structure and organization. And so that's what I mean by an enterprise fund within a local government. And we'll talk more about stormwater utilities as we go on. But rebate and cost share programs too are one of the finance areas that we're going to focus more on today. Here, there's some incentive by the government to encourage private landowners to install these water quality BMPs on their own private property. Then to sort of tie numbers 5 and 4 together, these fees are increasing to a level that commercial entities are paying attention to. The incentives, because the incentives now, you know, if they make financial sense, we'll have commercial customers of stormwater utilities starting to install their own BMPs. Loans are always a popular way to fund local government projects. Tax incentives are important, and credit trading is important in a growing area. And we won't have much time to talk about trading today, but it's an important area. And then this, lastly, this idea of green infrastructure projects being funded by a mechanism known as property assessed clean energy, or PACE in other areas, that we see a lot of potential. So that's an overview. If we start with sort of traditionally just using tax money, kind of looking at something as innovative as PACE. Okay, so when we talk about adapting more traditional methods to green infrastructure, here is where some of the crosswalking that I referred to at the beginning comes into play. One of the more traditional funding sources when it comes to water management at local governments has been the State Revolving Funds, or SRFs. And this is a diagram or a graphic that was used in one of the earlier webinars in this series. It's from EPA, and it specifically looks at the Clean Water, or CW, State Revolving Fund. There is a drinking water SRF as well. And however, I think the green infrastructure relates more directly to the clean water SRF in most states. But let me be clear that you can use the drinking water SRF funds for green infrastructure projects in some states. And this is because states have considerable flexibility in how they manage these programs. So as you'll see here, most of the money comes from the federal government to the state. The state puts in a 20% match. All states have these programs. And then in terms of who is eligible, that's where states have some flexibility in terms of the terms and the interest rates, etc. Some states are able to offer more attractive terms, more attractive interest rates, etc. for projects that they're trying to prioritize. And some states choose green infrastructure, right? So that's something to be aware of in terms of the state that you are living and working in, perhaps what the clean water SRF is focused on or incentivizing in that particular state, or trying to probably encourage that conversation to include more green infrastructure type projects. So I like this example from the state of Iowa's SRF program. So this is how they describe their program from like 1989 to the year 2002. It was, you know, if you enter, my son is a Boy Scout, so I kind of like the Swiss Army knife analogy here. This is how the state of Iowa's SRF program, this is how they described it. It was focused more on gray infrastructure. And then from 2003 to the present, you'll see they have a whole lot more diversity here. It's become a more sophisticated program. They're funding a variety of water quality and quantity related projects. And I should note that I pulled this slide from one of their presentations, and that was from back in 2014. So there might even be more tools now out there. And again, though not all SRF programs have to be this varied, so one area for you to engage at the state level is encouraging the SRF program in your state to fund a diverse set of projects. It's a little bit easier just to fund the traditional gray projects that we've been funding for a couple decades, but if you can encourage the states to be a little bit more diverse, that can really change the options for water quality and green infrastructure project options in your state. Once those changes at the state level have been made, then you can work with the local government utilities to let them know that they can fund more than just green infrastructure with SRF money in your state. So again, that crosswalking idea. All right, I'm gonna, before I get into this integration stuff here, just check with our moderators to see if there's anything we should be aware of. Any major questions? All right.
Nope.
Hi.
No questions so far.
Yeah, no questions at this point.
Okay, thanks. All right. Sorry, I think I went back there for a second. Okay, so when we talk about integration here into traditional budget and accounting processes, much of the financing for water quality is going to be generated at the local level. Now, I have some great charts and data that I showed in one of the previous webinars that shows the level of spending from the federal government on water projects versus the level of spending from state and local. And state and local really is where the money is coming from ultimately in the last couple decades. So since the local revenue generation is so important, how can we work with local government staff, so budget officers, accountants, etc., to integrate the concepts of green infrastructure into their long-standing accepted industry practices, right? That's the challenge. So this is one very direct or straightforward way. I'm not saying easy, but I'm saying straightforward. And that was to add watershed protection to the actual water or wastewater bill. So the city of Raleigh did this a number of years ago, and I'm not even sure at this point if they still have this on there. But think about the revenue generated here from this actual line item on all the customers' water and sewer bills that says watershed protection, right? So that's going to be money generated, but it's also a wonderful public education opportunity because folks are seeing the term watershed protection and hopefully thinking, well, what is a watershed? And you know, why do we need to protect it? And hopefully it's planting a seed there. So this is one way to kind of integrate green infrastructure or watershed management into the traditional sources like a bill, like a utility bill that comes in the mail. Also, another way to sort of integrate green infrastructure into the traditional budget process, I'll start by saying there are two big buckets, if you will, in local government budgeting. One is capital, which is actual, you know, big things, buildings, etc. And then the other part or bucket is operation and maintenance, or O&M for short. Green infrastructure, though, unfortunately, does not fall as neatly into either of these two buckets. So when you're doing budgeting, things fall, you know, either it's a capital expense or, you know, it's an O&M. But green infrastructure sort of challenges those divisions, if you will. There's a project right now that's being funded by the Water Research Foundation to integrate green infrastructure into what we call the Uniform Chart of Accounts. So that's what accountants use to come up with their budgets and that kind of thing. And so if we can fit some of the GI into this uniform chart of accounts, then accountants will become a little bit more comfortable and figure out, you know, how to account for green infrastructure. And so I believe that project is still ongoing, but it's again by the Water Research Foundation, so look out for it. This image here refers to a journal article that the Center for Watershed Protection published a few years ago, and it's this same idea of getting from gray to green in terms of accounting and budgeting. So, for example, here's how green infrastructure does not fit the traditional buckets well. Most gray or traditional infrastructure start to depreciate the day they're installed. So it's like maybe your parents told you, don't buy a new car, as you drive it off the parking lot, it's starting to depreciate. It's not worth the same thing, and it's, you know, you can't sell it back for the same price that you just bought it for a few minutes ago. So depreciation is a big concept in terms of gray infrastructure. But if you think about it, the day that you plant a tree, the tree does not start to depreciate, right? So trees are sort of the opposite. So let's look at a tree as, or the cost of a tree specifically, and let's consider that in terms of the benefits and the costs. So these considerations, you know, it's a laundry list, and to a lot of folks on this webinar today, these probably look familiar. So we know the green benefits. We know that they're energy savings, it reduces air pollution. To have more trees, it increases property values because they look better, and definitely their water quality, like runoff reduction benefits as well. In terms of costs, you know, the tree may or may not become diseased. You have to initially purchase the tree. So we can put together this list. When the tree roots get into the sidewalk, there might be sidewalk repair costs, etc. But these considerations are just not what some folks signed up for when they went into local government budgeting or accounting. And so this is a sort of a new host of costs that they need to figure out how to fit into their system, if you will. Sort of the good news is this organization, GASB, the Government Accounting Standards Board, or GASB as we call it. There was a little bit on GASB in webinar 1 as well in the series, but GASB puts out different statements. It's an independent organization that establishes accounting and financial standards. And they've had they've had this concept for a while, but recently they've come out and sort of clarified it. So GASB 62 or GASB Statement 62 allows what we call regulated operations, including green infrastructure, to be capitalized. So it helps to address this blurry line between green infrastructure being capital costs versus O&M, and which one, and you know, it gets hairy for local government folks to handle this. So the language isn't new, but in the accounting world, it means that there's a place for green infrastructure now, and you know, I didn't typically consider an asset before. So this has been big, and I think it just came out a year or two ago. So I'm not saying that you have to become a GASB expert, but maybe find a way to politely mention GASB 62 to the local government staff that you're interacting with, right? So just draw it to their attention, and then they can fit it into their accounting of the local government. But it's a big shift for many water utilities, which are used to thinking about fixed things like pipes and pumps as assets. Okay, we're gonna start talking about stormwater utilities now. I'll give a 5-second pause though. All right, pressing ahead. So stormwater utilities. We'll start with a national perspective here, and we'll drill down to regional and then even one specific state when that has to do with stormwater utility. So a stormwater utility is a separate utility from water or wastewater. It provides a dedicated, predictable source of revenue for water quality projects and green infrastructure projects. And it's really what any entity looking to manage, or any local government entity, I should say, looking to manage water quality should be aspiring towards. So in my opinion, the stormwater utility is really what you want to aim for, unless there are reasons that, and in some cases they are, that restrict the local government from getting to a stormwater utility. There are, as we can see from the slide here, over 1,680 utilities that are represented by these little brown dots from the 2018 survey that this university, the Western Kentucky University, conducts every year, more or less. But what you should note is that the 2017 survey only had, well, they had 42 utilities less. So in 1 year, there was an increase in 42 stormwater utilities across the country. And there's a story behind each one of these dots on this map, right? And what I'm going to drill down to in particular is credit or incentive programs that come along with each stormwater utility. So this chart just kind of looks at the number of utilities from this particular survey since 2007, and we can see that it has been steadily increasing. And we may see some spikes here. So for example, in New Jersey, they changed their statutes regarding stormwater utilities earlier in this year, 2019. So you may see more of these types of entities in that state, for instance. So that just happened in March of this year, where Governor Murphy signed into law something called the Clean Stormwater and Flood Reduction Act. And flood reduction is always going to be a good hook for folks who may not be all that interested in water quality, or they don't see some of the connections. Nobody wants their basements to flood. So in terms of talking to citizens or local government folks who are trying to address their customers and citizens' needs, flooded basements can really get you very far into the conversation, you know, if we're looking for hooks and areas of interest. Okay, so here we're gonna make sure everyone is still with us, and we're gonna have a poll that Deanna is gonna bring up. And the question is, does the community you work most in have a stormwater utility? And your choices are yes, no, or I don't know.
All right, so the answers are coming in, Stacey. About half the folks have voted. Let's give it a few more seconds.
Sure, and if you feel for some reason that your vote doesn't directly involve stormwater utility or a community, local government, you can answer the question based on the community in which you live, I guess.
All right, about 70% of folks have answered. I'm going to go ahead and give it 2 more seconds. 1 second, and I'm going to close it off. So you see about 57% of people said yes, they do have a stormwater facility. 34% responded no, and 9% are not sure.
Okay, all right. So 9% have some clear homework to go find that out. And the rest of us will hopefully develop some homework here on how to relate to or interact with the folks who are running that stormwater utility. Great. All right, so we'll move along here. And going back to this concept that it's most effective for water quality and quantity reasons, that's what the science tells us, right? To treat the stormwater as close as possible to where it's being generated. So where the snow is melting, where the rain is falling. We really need to encourage green infrastructure on private property. That's where the rain is falling, and that's where the snow is melting. So a public stormwater utility or local government utility cannot do it on its own. And so what is really important in the stormwater utility design is to have a reduction, some sort of a credit or discount where the monthly fee for the homeowner or even the commercial customer is reduced because they've installed some best management practices, right? So it allows the ratepayers to control and reduce their service fee. If a water utility does not have some way to give a credit or a discount for doing good things on your own property, then that utility is not in good legal standing. Then it starts to look more like a tax than a fee. And so it's a vulnerable place to be in legally. And so that's what that second bullet is about. You want to encourage private owner participation in both water quality, and relief improvements. So the other thing is we'll see that there isn't enough public financing for total stormwater management. So we want some private money to come in too. And by people installing it on their own property, we're bringing in some private funds. So from the...
I wonder if I jump in for a clarifying question, and that is, do you consider a community that charges a stormwater fee as being a stormwater utility? A question came in from a participant. Can you clarify what a utility means?
Yeah. Sure, thanks for bringing that up. So yes, if there is even a regional utility, so a utility is where you're paying a fee, $5, $8 per month, something like that, as a bill that's specifically for stormwater management. So I believe that description, yes, it would be considered a stormwater utility. In the local government world, a utility is sort of separate and almost business-like in its expenses. It should be self-sustaining. You shouldn't have a whole bunch of money coming from the general fund, tax money coming into the utility. And so we call it an enterprise fund. But yes, that's good. I'm glad that person asked. But we looked at national stormwater numbers, and then we're kind of drilling down to the Southeast on this question of incentive programs. So how we asked a few years ago when I was with the Environmental Finance Center, how well subscribed to is your credit program for your stormwater utility? And these were the responses from some stormwater utility staff. And we've seen that. It's not, they have these programs on books, on the paper, but they don't, not a lot of customers are subscribing to these credit programs. And so one of the questions to improve water quality is to get more folks subscribed or figure out why they're not subscribing. We also asked some Southeastern stormwater utilities what would happen if a lot of customers sort of suddenly began to seek these credits. And so this was kind of their response, right? Some of them said all of the above, but nobody said that they thought their utility would go bankrupt. So that's good. They have good financial models that sort of could compensate for the, people taking advantage of these incentives. The second option was my capital improvement program would have to go on hold. They'd have to reduce their revenues would be so reduced by these credits that they wouldn't be able to do their capital improvement projects. And there were several folks in the room who thought that could be the effect. And then their staff would get overwhelmed, and then we gave them a couple more options, all of the above being one of them, right? So drilling down again from the southeast, we're going to look at a specific state. So this is the state of Georgia. And again, the Environmental Finance Center did a survey of stormwater utilities in the state of Georgia a couple years ago. And we'll see here that there's just a range of what is actually charged in terms of a fee per month by the different stormwater utilities that exist in Georgia. And again, the Environmental Finance Center does great work on water quality financing, and their resources and tools are almost always accessible online from their website. Okay, looking at Georgia again, honing in there, we asked in this Environmental Finance Center survey a couple of years ago, how are the stormwater fees collected? And this is equipping you as a person involved with a grassroots organization. It's equipping you for talking to local government elected officials and utility staff. The point is that how they choose to bill for stormwater can have major implications on the collection rate, as we'll see in the next slide, right? So these are the options that you see on this pie chart. They can either put it on the utility bill for water and wastewater. They can put it on the property tax bill, so that's billed once a year basically. They can send a separate standalone stormwater bill, and I guess a couple of them we couldn't figure out how they were actually billing. But the method, the way of collecting these fees makes a big difference. So for instance, here you see that the stormwater utility fees in Georgia, at least that were collected on the property tax bill, there was a 96% collection rate. Whereas a standalone bill not only represents an additional cost to mail those bills out, but the collection rate was a little bit lower. So those are the kinds of topics to bring up with the state, the staff at the local government that might be developing or tweaking their stormwater utility program. This chart is looking, again, comparing Georgia to the rest of the country. You'll see here that about 86% of Georgia's stormwater utilities seem to have a credit program. Many, about 67% of utilities at the national level do not have a credit program. So you really, as water community advocates, should really encourage utilities to have a credit program for equity reasons and legal protection that comes from having a credit program, as well, of course, for the enhanced water quality and water quantity that we see from having BMPs on private property distributed across the jurisdiction.
Hey, right. Stacey, this is we had a question about the 3,000 square foot of impervious surface.
Okay, let me go back here. Are we talking about this slide maybe?
Yes.
It must be this one.
So
that's a good. Sure. You want to elaborate on the question?
Yeah, it just says, what does the 3,000 square foot of impervious surface mean?
Okay, excellent question. So this is the situation when you're developing a new stormwater utility for, let's say, a city. Ideally, the city looks at its customers. It looks at how big property tends to be by the individual households within that jurisdiction. And so let's say it's a fairly affluent community, maybe they'll decide that, most of our properties are about 5,000 square feet. Another community that's small, that has smaller houses, or maybe more of an urban sort of community, might use 2,000 square feet. So for this particular survey, the Environmental Finance Center wanted to find, if you're going to compare the fees, right? If I'm paying $5 a month and you're paying 10, if we're looking at different what we call ERUs, or different square feet areas, then it gets confusing. So what happened is we standardized this so that we're looking at 3,000 square feet for all of the utilities in the state of Georgia, just to compare apples to apples.
Great. And Stacey, another question before you leave this section. Can you talk a little bit more about how a credit program provides legal protection to a stormwater utility? In what way is that a legal protection?
Okay, so I'll try not to get on the soapbox too much here, but this is how it works. So the opponents of stormwater utility fees say that this is a rain tax. It is not a fee. They say it's not based on something that I'm using, right? So my water bill, my drinking water bill, let's say, I can control that. I can decide, oh my gosh, my water bill is too high. I'm not going to wash my car next month. And then my water bill would have gone down because it is a fee for service. It's not a tax. It's not something fixed that I have to pay $50 every month for water. I could control my use and therefore my bill. The same with wastewater. But if we don't have some sort of credit program for a stormwater utility, then it does start to look like a tax and not a fee. Because if we go back to the ERU, or the equivalent residential unit here, remember this 3,000 square feet? Let's just imagine a community where everybody in this city had a house that was exactly 3,000 square feet, and our stormwater utility folks decided that we will all pay $10 a month for stormwater water management, right? If I decide to put a rain garden on my house, then it's almost like I've reduced my impervious surface from 3,000 effectively to maybe 2,000. So now I'm collecting the water that's running off my driveway and my roof into a rain garden on my property, and I'm treating the stormwater there. Then I should not be paying $10 a month. And if you make me pay $10 a month, even though I put in that BMP, then you're treating this like a tax. Like I don't have control over it, and then you can get sued as a utility, and it has happened, and it hasn't gone very well for the utilities. So I'm happy to have had that question, and hopefully that clarifies it. Should we move on?
Please do.
Okay, great. So now we're going to touch on some of the newer or other sources of financing. And this first slide is very busy, but I kind of refer to this section as a laundry list, right? These were pulled from a list that somebody from EPA did a presentation on recently. Her name is Stacey Isaac Berahzer. On the left, she shows EPA funding sources for green infrastructure. On the right, she shows non-EPA sources. So there are a lot of different funding sources out there. And I'll let you guys, I know you have the handout, so you can look at some of those later on. I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach. But I also want to point out that if you're looking for loans and grants for water quality or any type of water project, be sure to tell the folks that you're working with at the local utility about this water finance clearinghouse. So this has come online from EPA just a couple years ago, or maybe a few years ago at this point. It's a good source to play around with yourself, and you can look for funding sources related to your state, related to whether you're looking for green infrastructure versus drinking water, etc. So it's an interesting thing to play around with, and a good resource from EPA. But if we take this list here, sources of green infrastructure financing, sort of continued, right? I want to focus on a few of these. So we have P3s, public-private partnerships. We have this new kid on the block called WIFIA. Things like hazard mitigation, environmental impact bonds, Amanda's going to really focus on. And then nutrient trading, again, I want it on the list, but we're not going to have a lot of time to talk about that today. The main point is that there's not enough public funds to handle all the stormwater needs. So we're going to have to get P3s involved, private investments. And I think one way to look at private investments is a homeowner putting in, I don't know, a couple $1,000s worth of money to put a rain garden on their own property, for instance, or a rain barrel. That's one form of private investment, but a more, I guess, official form is going to get into this particular report that was put together by the Environmental Finance Center at UNC as well. They have, I think, this is a 2016 report, and they have several different 9 different profiles, but this one happens to be Prince George's County in the northeast part of the country. So P3 financing, I will say, is not a silver bullet. What it does, the idea behind P3s is that the public sector can benefit from the private sector's efficiency and innovation. So that's the concept. The idea of the private sector sort of absorbing some of the risk is really very central to the P3 model. For the private sector, the benefits are that it gets to access a market that normally is limited to the public sector. So again, if you're interested in more examples of P3s across the country, you can check out this resource from the Environmental Finance Center. I want to mention WIFIA. It's a fairly new source of funding from the EPA. These two slides that I'll show you here concerning WIFIA are actually pulled from the EPA, and this is what they use to describe the program, right? So it's a whole lot of leveraging. So there's 16 million in appropriations, and it's a bit complicated, but it can fund like $12 billion in infrastructure investments in the end. And the good news is that you'll see over here on the right that stormwater is one of the types of projects that are eligible for WIFIA funds. This is the process or timeline for WIFIA. So right now they're reviewing projects for this cycle of funding. This term here, letter of interest submission. If you're working with any utilities or any communities that want to apply for WIFIA for stormwater or green infrastructure, that's a very innocent term, that letter of interest. It's actually like a 40-page document that's quite detailed, but it's a sizable funding pot, and so we're seeing a lot of communities pursue this WIFIA funding. And then I wanted to just throw out the idea that there are pots of money that are not centrally water related that can be made to relate to water. So we'll take a look at hazard mitigation here. But for example, arts has been one area. Just think about how art can be associated with water towers and artwork on cisterns, etc. So I encourage you to think outside of the traditional box for funding these types of projects. So the hazard mitigation piece, and these slides are from BEMA. Terry Lund presented this on another webinar, and it's talking about the different types. So GEMA, it's a Georgia Environmental Management, hazard mitigation sort of program, and they actually have different programs within their purview, and they rely on green infrastructure for some of this. So they define green infrastructure for their intents and purposes. Of course, it's all focused on storm and flood mitigation, but they recognize that green infrastructure can help prevent flooding. And so this is really a significant part of money too that's being used now to include green infrastructure. So, again, mention this to the water utility staff that you may be working with as something that they may not have considered before. It's not very traditional water management, but because of the associated risks of flooding, it can be in terms of green infrastructure. So these are examples. They'll fund things that have to have soil stabilization benefits, and that would reduce the localized risk for flooding. All right, so we are gonna go to poll 2 here, and it's asking you to select which one of the following you have the least experience with. If we think about putting out future resources on any of these topics, I'm wondering which one of these maybe you've had least exposure to: public-private partnerships, the WIFIA loan program, hazard mitigation, funding for green infrastructure, environmental impact bonds that Amanda's going to talk about, or nutrient trading.
All right, we've had about half the folks voting. Please go ahead and click on the one that you have least experience with. Give it about 5 more seconds. Okay, we've had about 80% of the folks voting. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. So you can see the responses. Let me see, about 26% have least experience with WIFIA, and 26% for the environmental impact funds, the bonds, excuse me. 24% of folks don't have experience with nutrient trading, and then hazard mitigation funds and public-private partnerships are about the same at 12%.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. Excellent. So now I'm going to just try to present, if you will, some do's and don'ts. So again, the idea here is that you have a chance to interact with local government staff or elected officials in a community where you're working. Either you have the chance or you've created the chance, right? Here are some recommendations for having a productive and positive exchange or conversation with those folks. So don't start off by bashing gray infrastructure is my recommendation. There is a role for gray infrastructure as well. Do talk about green jobs. So the term economic development appeals to local government folks, right? So it's a good term to use, and green jobs really are economic development, but sometimes you can play the role of pointing that out. Do relate green infrastructure to this idea of the triple bottom line, or this concept. And this is a concept that instead of one bottom line, there should be three. So if you want to think of them as profit, people, and the planet. So social and environmental concerns in addition to just profits. And that's really a great place to put in something like green infrastructure. Do point to industry programs such as one that we mentioned earlier, which was called the Utility of the Future. So this Utility of the Future, I realize I didn't talk much about, but it's a concept that's defined by clean water utility leaders that are pioneering innovative technologies and practices, cutting edge practices really, within the industry. And they are focused, kind of like the triple bottom line, on resource recovery, efficiency, and sustainability. So it used to be the utilities of the past, let's say, focused really on meeting environmental regulations as their ceiling. That's all they were really focused on doing, and that was their goal. But now we're seeing utilities of the future being more of a partner in their communities and trying to address things like resource recovery, efficiency, and sustainability. Do help local government utility staff dispel the myth that a stormwater utility fee is a rain tax, and I'm glad to that question. Hopefully you guys can effectively discuss that concept. It's not a rain tax. You can't stop the rain from falling, but you can manage the stormwater on your property, and therefore it's a fee that you have some control over if the utility has a credit program. And do help make the connection between equity issues. And stormwater can be a major percentage of the wastewater bill in some areas where there is no stormwater utility. And so there are equity issues involved there. Something else that we're seeing in terms of equity is tiered stormwater utility fees. So remember, we talked about the equivalent residential unit. We talked about that 3,000 square foot number. In some cases, communities are realizing, look, not every residential customer in our community looks the same. So they have 2 or 3 different tiers depending on the size of the property with the impervious area. So equity is built in and can be built in more. I like this quote, I think is really illustrative, from Salem, Oregon. They said, the purpose of creating the utility, the stormwater utility, is to change how your stormwater services are funded, making it more fair and equitable to both our wastewater and stormwater customers. And so that's a nice way to put it. I think it clarifies this equity issue. A few additional resources for you to take note of, and you should be able to click on these in the PDF version of these slides and go straight to these websites. And there's my contact information, and I'm getting ready to pass this on to Amanda for her comments on environmental impact bonds from the City of Atlanta's perspective. And I'm gonna move the slides forward, Amanda.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yes. Loud and clear.
All right. Thanks, Stacey. That was an excellent overview of all of many different options for funding and financing green infrastructure. I am going to focus on one, as Stacey said, that and just sort of tell the story of Atlanta's experience with the first publicly issued environmental impact bond in the country, and why we came to use it, what it's all about, what our experience was so far. All right. Okay, next slide. Thanks. So just the Department of, oh, can you go back one? Great. So the Department of Watershed Management in the City of Atlanta is a regional water and wastewater utility serving 1.2 million customers Our core services are delivering safe drinking water, collecting and treating wastewater. We're also tasked with managing stormwater. Stormwater management is led by our Office of Watershed Protection, which I'm in, but it's actually handled across multiple offices. However, we have no stormwater utility. All right. But stormwater is a challenge citywide. High volumes and velocity of the stormwater runoff are degrading waterways, affecting public health, cause flooding and damage infrastructure and property, all of which are threaten the city's resilience. Furthermore, due to climate change, Atlanta is experiencing more frequent and severe storms in recent years. Okay. And the Resilient Atlanta Plan, which is Atlanta's long-term resilience strategy, identifies the need to fund and implement comprehensive stormwater management, particularly in the face of climate change. At the same time, the city and our department is committed to the use of green infrastructure to supplement traditional gray infrastructure projects for stormwater management. As Stacey talked about, green infrastructure projects incorporate natural systems into the built environment or seek to restore the natural hydrology of watersheds prior to urbanization and reduce the volume, velocity of polluted runoff entering our streams and our pipes. It can be more cost-effective than green infrastructure projects and approaches, and better address neighborhood-scale impacts of stormwater, with the added advantage of providing multiple additional benefits, including things like community enhancement, spurring economic and workforce development, creating jobs, providing wildlife habitat and green space, improving air quality, easing urban heat, providing recreation and educational opportunities. And so there are many benefits that can be, many outcomes of a green infrastructure project. And our city council, sorry, just one more point, there in 2017 approved a green infrastructure strategic action plan that promotes the use of green infrastructure across departments in the city and sets an annual runoff reduction goal of 225 million gallons through green infrastructure. Okay. However, as I mentioned, and as in many municipalities, we are challenged by a lack of adequate funding for stormwater and green infrastructure without a dedicated source for our program. And so one way we're working towards our green infrastructure goals is through the regulatory approach under our amended post-development stormwater ordinance. Since 2013, we've permitted over 5,200 private projects on commercial and residential development. However, as you can see in this map here, which shows those locations of the projects that have been permitted, they are very much concentrated in northern and eastern areas, tied to economic development patterns, and that's clustered in areas where there is more economic investment and not equitably distributed throughout the city. Lots of gaps in our southern and western portions. Equity is a very high priority right now of the Department of Watershed Management, our commissioner, and the city as a whole under our Mayor Bottoms. So we need to turn to creative and alternative funding sources, leverage partnerships, et cetera, in order to address the underserved areas of the city that are disproportionately impacted by stormwater runoff and the associated challenges. So, next slide. The Environmental Impact Bond, there we go, provided the Department of Watershed and Management exactly this tool for financing green infrastructure in a particular watershed in need with a high societal impact. Now, this opportunity to structure and issue an EIB came about actually through the city's partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation, 100 Resilient Cities, and its innovative financing program. They had a challenge, and our department was awarded a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to pilot the first publicly issued municipal EIB, as they're called. And this grant funded the services of a couple of advisory firms, Quantified Ventures, who are impact investment experts, and Neighborly, and to help us structure, market, underwrite, and issue the bonds, because they wanted to really test and pilot the use of this new innovative financing and see if it would work in the municipal bond market, in the public municipal bond market. And so this bond is giving us access to $13.5 million, which will finance 6 green infrastructure projects, all of which are designed to capture and reduce stormwater runoff, while also providing multiple community benefits and improving public health, resilience, and quality of life in a high priority watershed. So what's an EIB? Next slide here, just to give a little overview of what we're talking about. EIBs are a form of debt similar to a traditional bond, except that part of the payment is determined by how successfully they achieve a predefined environmental or social outcome. And that's what is referred to as the pay for success model. So investors, you can see in this diagram here, the investors provide the capital. The city uses it to construct projects. The performance of those projects is measured by a third party, and whether or not the outcome exceeds a defined performance threshold determines how much investors are paid back by the issuer, i.e. the municipality. And sort of the central elements of an EIB are that, its ability to model and assign an economic value to all of the project benefits, multiple benefits of these projects, and price those into the performance-based financial structure. And then evaluate actual project outcomes by an independent third-party evaluator who then validates those outcomes post-construction. And so why, in our next slide, why did we use an EIB? What are the advantages for any issuer, municipality, and for the Department of Watershed Management in particular? Well, there's several. It's accessing a new source of investment capital, and this new type of investor who is, I've been told, becoming more common in the millennial generation of who are looking for more meaningful ways to invest their money. They're interested in environmental and community benefits. So that in turn allows us, our department, to prioritize these certain types of impactful projects, these transformative sort of watershed improvement and urban ecosystem restoration projects that wouldn't otherwise rise to the top and get priority within our CIP, and also to implement a critical mass of those within a certain watershed. It also gives the issuer the ability to test innovative projects and to manage the risk of those innovative approaches by sharing some of that risk with the investors who are willing to take it on in exchange for the positive outcomes. And we shared that risk in particular with a below market interest rate, which I'll talk about later. And then also by assigning an economic value to the project benefits and pricing them into the structure, it creates, which we really liked, this shared success model that aligns incentives. So it's kind of a win-win. The issuer shares the value of the project benefits, is successful with investors, and then so that these environmental and social returns are aligned with financial returns for the parties. And then finally, evaluating the actual outcomes post-construction of the projects allows the city, the issuer, to demonstrate success and just to learn from the experience in order to inform future planning, as well as to create pathways to future funding at a larger scale. All right, so as I mentioned, stormwater issues are experienced throughout the city, but they do disproportionately impact certain vulnerable communities, one of which is the Upper Proctor Creek Watershed, and this is where the EIB funded projects are located. Proctor Creek, it's actually the only watershed that's completely within the Atlanta city boundaries, and it begins in highly urbanized downtown Atlanta, where creek is buried underground beneath impervious surfaces, and that caused all of the runoff to flow directly downstream to many of the historic neighborhoods that lie between downtown and the Chattahoochee River, and that's brought many associated, challenges. Proctor Creek itself, which was once a healthy community asset, is one of the most impaired streams in the region. The surrounding neighborhoods many of them are economically distressed. There's high unemployment and high rates of poverty, as well as public health threats due to regular flooding, overflows, brownfields, lack of green space. So there's a huge need in this watershed for these types of urban restoration and water quality projects that really compete and struggle for limited funding in our department, but have enormous impacts on a community that in many ways has suffered a lot of neglect in the past. So that's why we focused on this particular area. And then in the next slide, shows you the projects. Like I said, there are 6 total. They fall into basically 3 main categories: green infrastructure BMPs, mainly bioretention practices, along streetscapes, particularly in the right-of-ways of one flood-prone neighborhood, as well as in a couple of city parks. We have a couple of large stream and floodplain restoration projects that will be reconnecting some degraded stream sections with their floodplain for flood storage and habitat, and constructed wetlands within another flood-prone plagued area that is going to provide capacity relief, water quality improvement, and a neighborhood amenity, among other things. So the primary goals of the projects are to reduce flooding and to improve water quality by reducing the volume, rate, and pollutant load of stormwater runoff entering our streams, protect against tributaries. This will both improve the quality of life of the local residents, but it will also result in significant avoided costs to the city, the department, and the public in general. In addition, there are multiple layers of environmental, social, economic, and community benefits associated with these projects. So they mentioned new green space, restored habitat, improved public health and local job creation are some. And so these are the types of projects with these layered benefits that are well suited to the EIB model. All right, so how does this all work? So first of all, in order to structure this performance-based transaction, we had to define an outcome metric by which to measure success. What does success mean? Or how are we looking at performance? So, after considering a number of options, we chose to use the aggregated volume of stormwater capture capacity across the projects, and we did that for several reasons. One, that they are relevant and they can be applied to a variety of different kinds of types of green infrastructure practices in different locations. Our volume capture is directly related to both of our primary goals, flood reduction and water quality improvement. It's a simple metric for investors to understand. It's directly related to the sort of environmental interests and that they're looking for, and it's an objective and verifiable and cost-effective measure as well. And it allows for consistency in both the prediction and the measurement of outcomes. So that was the thinking behind choosing the metric. And so then structuring the EIB, the next slide. What's interesting about it, and so you have to come up with several different terms, and what was a learning experience for everyone involved is structuring the EIB for issuance requires linking your project design to the financial terms of the bond, since it's related. The design is related to project performance, and the terms are as well. And so that's something new and different. And I'll touch on that a little later, but there's 2 major inputs to the performance model. One is an economic analysis to determine the value of the benefits from the project to the city and the department. And then also a probability analysis of the expected outcome, in this case volume, our volume metric, to determine the range of sort of the range of volumes and the likelihood of achieving a given volume. And so those two models, so that model using those two analyses helps us set these three main terms of the bond, and the rate of return basically on based on the rate of return on the investment. So looking a little closer at the inputs in the next slide, we first of all, and we worked closely with Quantified Ventures, as I mentioned, in coming up with our economic valuation, and defining the terms overall. And so the economic analysis is conservative, in that we assign value to 5 monetizable outcomes. Some of them are volume dependent, some are volume independent. And then we sort of modeled how those benefits change with volume. And so we determined, where we calculated that the $13.5 million set of projects are expected to generate over $19 million in outcomes. In addition, of course, to many meaningful intangible outcomes. I mean, there are, of course, non-monetizable outcomes as well, which is why, this is conservative, but still shows all of the many benefits that you can consider from these projects. And then the probability analysis we developed with the help of our engineering team at Jacobs, who were the designers of the GI projects. And basically, it's based on factors related to construction feasibility of all these projects, and using various statistical techniques, generated a single probability curve for achieving different storage volumes across all 6 projects together in aggregate. Okay, and then tying these together, the economic and probability analysis gave us a mean expected volume outcome and the value of the benefits of that expected outcome. And that allowed us to set a high performance threshold and a performance payment amount, which, along with a base interest rate, would optimize the expected rate of return for investors. So the threshold so our mean expected volume, is 6.3 million gallons. Our high performance threshold is 6.52 million gallons. So that is what we have defined as our high performance. And so the idea is at that point, the additional economic the idea at that point is that the additional economic value generated between expected volume and high performance exceeds the performance payment. So the city is sharing a portion of that value while still receiving a net positive benefit, while the expected for the investors on their end, their sort of expected rate of return is going to be it's going to even out based on the probability. And then in the next slide, this kind of shows how this works. We have a two-tiered structure. As I mentioned, there's a single threshold, and based on our probability analysis, there's that high performance outcome, there's about a 27% chance of exceeding that. And this is a different structure. It's actually an innovation over the one previous EIB that DC Water, it was a private placement by DC Water, where they had an upside and a downside, which is a little more complicated. This is simplified and also was really more of a risk share, as well as giving investors more of an opportunity to share in the benefits. And basically, there's a base case at which the department is paying a below market interest rate. That's the transfer of risk if they don't perform the projects as expected or above that threshold. And then if the projects do exceed the performance threshold, the investors receive a one-time supplemental performance payment In our case, it's a $1 million, obviously, prorated across the investors. And then this slide shows the timeline, basically over the process of putting this bond together. March 2018 is when the city announced that we were going to be partnering with Rockefeller and Quantified Ventures and Neighborly, that we had been awarded this opportunity. And it was about a year-long process to bring the transaction to fruition. We actually started a little even before that. So over which we had to go through city council. We had to have legislation approved for all of this. There was a investor education effort by Neighborly and others, and all the other sort of normal steps in issuing a municipal bond, and we closed successfully on January 31st of this year. And then I guess following up, going back to the timeline, it's a 10-year bond, so the department will pay regular bond payments over that 10-year period, but we have the evaluation is in actually year 6. So we have, right now we're completing design, we procurement, we'll construct the projects, we'll report, and then the projects, the independent evaluator will measure and evaluate the projects, issue a separate report, and determine whether or not that performance payment is due. And so we basically have 5 years to complete the projects. And some takeaways. There were many lessons learned doing something that was new and different. Can be painful as well, but first lesson takeaway is that EIBs are marketable offerings in the public sector. They received ratings from Moody's and S&P. They were the first impact bonds to have achieved that, and they have been sold to actually a mix of impact investors as well as more traditional institutional investors looking to diversify. And we have the funding to implement these projects. We also, another takeaway is that this volumetric capacity is a viable metric from comparing outcomes across different kinds of green infrastructure. It allows for one-time measurement and evaluation versus long-term monitoring, which is advantageous in this sort of a structure when investors are looking for a certain date when they can know how much money they're going to be repaid. Allows for consistency as well. And then the two-tiered performance structure, as I mentioned, can be replicated by other municipalities, and we feel like it potentially makes the whole approach a little more accessible, and particularly when there's not a consent decree driver. And then timing was something we learned a lot about. It's sort of timing of the bond issuance is important in 2 respects, both in structuring, because the design process has to be timed with the financing process and the structuring the bond so that you're able to determine what the outcomes of your projects might be. So making sure that you are far enough along in the design process and you are sort of well coordinated in that way is important. Also, ample time to market these bonds is essential, particularly in this one being the first. Baltimore is about to issue one, and there's others underway right now. But with an inaugural deal, the municipal bond market has a pretty standard way of doing business, and it has for a long time. So there wasn't a lot of precedent for this type of a bond. Innovation takes time, so a lot of investors want to see some track records and things, and just need to understand, really wrap their heads around what it is, see a lot of the documentation, and feel comfortable. So enough time to educate investors is after you've sort of figured out your terms is also important. And so a lot of these things did lead to higher transaction costs for this pilot, which, so it was great that we had grant support. That was key to putting it together. And, that was Rockefeller's intent, basically, to fund a demonstration project, provide the precedent, and provide some of these tool sort of models that can then be shared and customized by other municipalities. And then I guess the final lesson was that it is very it is complicated and eye-opening, trying to tie the project design to financing terms, because it involves coordinating across departments with your engineers and project manager teams, interacting with the finance and the bond council. And those are sort of two different worlds that speak different languages. So that was a lot of coordination that we feel that we've actually laid down a good foundation for that for the future. So those are some of my takeaways, and I guess now we can have any questions.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Please, folks, go ahead and use the chat and question box to pose your questions. While people do that, Amanda, I'm wondering, when you say the relatively high transaction cost, can you give an estimate, aside from the funds that Rockefeller provided, I imagine, to actually fund the projects, the operation, the setting up the bond itself, what is the price tag? What was the price for Atlanta to do that?
Well, I will say, I'm honestly not sure what the difference between a normal bond issuance, and I could look into that. But I know the value of the of the grant was about $200,000.
Oh, okay, great. And then the questions come in, have the previous financings been looked at under the municipality's rating, or becomes, I'm not sure if this, let's see if this makes sense, have the previous financings been looked at under the municipal rating, or becomes project finance outside the issuer rating? If I don't know enough about this topic to make complete sense of the question, does that make sense, Amanda?
I'm not sure exactly if I'm understanding the question, but the Department of Watershed Management has huge municipal bond issues, otherwise to fund our CIP, and all of those things went into the ratings, everything that, and so are regularly rated for those bonds, and so all of those, all of our, departmental finances basically went into the ratings for this one as well.
Great.
Okay, Deanna, maybe I can take a stab at that, just kind of more holistically, that question of ratings. So, to float bonds or to issue bonds generally takes something like 40 different types of professionals. So you don't want to issue bonds for, $10,000. It's a big process that Amanda laid us through. And it's expensive to pay all these professionals, for instance. So it's reserved for big projects in terms of the, a large dollar value. So I think the $20,000 from the Rockefeller Center certainly helped with this. And the other thing I was going to say is I think the person who's asking the question raises a good point about credit rating. So there are 3 agencies, probably I think there might be a 4th one now, that give scores to local governments and utilities. So just like you have a credit score based on your personal financial record, there's Fitch, there's Moody's, that give local governments a credit score, if you will, or rating. And if you have a good track record financially, say as a city, then you can access the debt market at lower interest rates generally. So that's the incentive there. But anyway, just kind of giving a more general overview related to the question that was asked.
Great.
Yep. Great.
Let me ask another question that Jeremy poses. Are there good publicly available resources that explain how to conduct the analysis, quantification of the social and environmental outcomes that can help translate those outcomes into dollars, dollar cents? Is there anything we might send?
We sort of came up with our own, although we did use some tools and some precedents. In New York, City of New York, it used to be publicly available, but it's not anymore. They had a tool for quantifying benefits of green infrastructure and values. I know there are other resources out there, and people have tried to do this in different ways. We have not. There are actually, we're happy to share our approach. And we don't have the EIB. We're putting together a website right now. We've had a few white papers that are actually coming out. And so we'll share kind of the approach that we took to it. But I don't know, Stacey, if you have other ideas of good resources for doing that.
Yeah, I was going to try to bring up a resource that the Environmental Finance Center had put together, trying to find it here. There was a project a few years ago that was funded by the EPA, and the center looked at this question of how much does a stand of forest or something like that, or the economic benefits of having trees, for instance. And so it's not really environmental finance, it's more environmental economics, if you will. But let me see if I can find that really quickly here. I will say that it's if you do want to go to the Environmental Finance Center website, there's a catalog. So I think often I get asked that question. Can you justify to me so I can tell this developer why they should not get rid of this wetland or this stand of trees? And so my response is no, I cannot. I don't do environmental economics. But there are some folks who have, and so we pulled together sort of an inventory or catalog of resources that could be used. So that was a few years ago, and Deanna, I can try to find that resource and put it out there. But again, the caveat is that it was a few years ago.
That's great. Yeah, in the question box, there's a lot of interest on how those values were arrived at, how benefits were quantified and qualified. So any resources you might send my way, Amanda and Stacey, we can add it to a follow-up email for folks. Let me start to wrap things up. We're at the bottom of the hour. I do want to share, hopefully folks can see my screen. I'm having trouble discerning what you all can see at this point. Let me know if not. But I want to let you know that Stacey and Amanda are going to be available to do office hours to answer your questions in greater detail next, the 29th of August. So I think that is next Thursday at 1 o'clock Eastern. If you want to just send me an email to RSVP. This is where we can get into greater detail about some of the ins and outs of how the Atlanta bond was structured. Please do take a minute to fill out the webinar survey. I added that link onto the chat box as well. And here I'm including a couple of emails to keep it abreast of future webinars and to access the drinking water guide that we mentioned on the front end. It sounds like there are some folks who are not accessing the handout section in the webinar room. So I'll go ahead and include in the link that you'll be emailed in a couple of hours with the webinar recording, I'll go ahead and add the PDF of the handouts to make sure that everybody has access to that. So without further ado, I want to just thank our presenters. Again, this is Deanna Toledo at River Network. Let me know about office hours if you're interested, but I want to take time to simply thank Stacey Berahzer and Amanda Hallauer. Thank you so much for your expertise. This has been a great session. a lot of interest in getting follow-up information from folks here in the chat box. And just again, to remind everybody that Stacey and Amanda are going to be available on the 29th to answer your questions. So please join us at those office hours. Just let me know at dtoledo@rivernetwork.org if you're going to be able to join. So Amanda, Stacey, any last thoughts or comments?
Oh, just thank you. You guys were a great conference.
Yep. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Have a great rest of the afternoon, and hopefully we'll see some of you at office hours next week. Have a great day.